The theme of my talk is spiritualism in war and peace towards a transpersonal history. And I want to first begin by defining what I mean by transpersonal history. It's not a phrase that maybe all of you are familiar with. You've probably heard of economic history or military history or women's history or social history. You know, you can do degrees in this stuff at the University of Sussex and Oxford and London, where I did my degree in history. But you can't do degrees as yet in transpersonal history, and I think this is a lacuna. Transpersonal history is a thesis I came up with for my own doctoral studies at the University of London after 20 years research into the history of the Cold War and the failure on this planet to get peace since 1945 is the time period I looked at. And we've had a period of raging ideological conflict on the planet. We've had rival systems, belief systems, religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc. We've had, Marxism and capitalism at loggerheads. We've even now got that in the Korean Peninsula. We've got North Korea and South Korea and America, rattling sabres at each other. So I studied the history of all this in great detail, and I argued that only a transpersonal history can begin to bring peace to this planet. Transpersonal is a word coined by Jung, Carl Jung, the psychologist, to mean psychic and spiritual phenomena that are part of human experience, which transcend normal states of consciousness. A transpersonal psychology is a psychology that accepts spiritual phenomena and then attempts to study them scientifically. So transpersonal psychology is being developed by Abraham Maslow, Carl Jung, obviously, Assagioli, and Ken Wilber particularly, and other many psychologists and psychotherapists and advanced thinkers on the planet who, for my doctoral thesis, I produced an encyclopedia of hundreds of these thinkers who've been at the forefront of research into the nature of consciousness and what is the soul, what actually are we as thinking people. Now, many of them have had a strong interest in spiritualism because obviously as spiritualists you look at, you accept the hypothesis of survival after death, and indeed you have empirical evidence for that as fact. In the materialist schools of psychology, those kind of phenomena are called pathological. People that have those experiences are having them for, they will try and explain those away. But transpersonal psychology takes those experiences seriously. Now, what I'm talking about by transpersonal history is re-looking at the history of mankind, but factoring those experiences back in. So we know that, the whole history of Islam depends on a prophet called Muhammad having certain transpersonal experiences. We know that the history of Christianity wouldn't exist unless Jesus has had similar experiences, and Paul and the saints and the early apostles of the church. These people are having, we could call them, scientifically, they're transpersonal experiences. The same with Buddha and his Enlightenment. That was a transpersonal experience. And many, many people throughout history. It seems to me the evidence of history shows that we are what I call Homo noeticus. We are Homo sapiens. But that sapience, that wisdom, includes the spiritual dimension, right? And for historians to try and write that out of history is just bonkers, actually. The idea of a materialist history is like, looking at everything through monochrome, black and white. So that's my definition of transpersonal history. It's the scientific study of history, using all the methodologies that conventional history does, but adding in the factor of the spiritual, the paranormal, the supernatural dimension of human experience, both in individual and in collective terms. So, the phenomenology of the saints, of the miraculous, spiritual healing experiences, things like Lourdes, all these things would be the subject of transpersonal history. Now, how does that relate to war and peace? Because that's what I'm going to be looking at. It's a fact in life that many people who worked for peace have been strongly motivated by their transpersonal beliefs. So one thinks of Christ and Buddha, who were great peacemakers, but also more recently Gandhi, who was motivated by a strong spiritual faith, Martin Luther King, who likewise, George Fox, founder of the Quakers, Tolstoy. These are some of the great names of peace witness throughout history. And I think pretty much all of them had a very strong spiritual streak in them. And that's indeed what gave them an ethic of peacemaking and solving conflicts. So, now, if we look back in history, a lot of history is lost to us. It's prehistory. We don't have archival evidence. We have archaeology, and we have remains of findings of archaeologists. We have things like Stonehenge, we have ancient monuments. The evidence points to quite a peace-loving time in early history, right up until urbanization kicks in. Even in Neolithic times, the villages and towns like Çatalhöyük in Turkey don't show much evidence of walls and defence and weapons. Seems that our ancestors lived pretty much in harmony. The archaeological record shows that they had a strong developed religious sense, and they emphasised both a god and a goddess element. There was a understanding of the sacredness of the female, and which may have given a kind of sense of non-violence to the community. If the mother was sacred, the goddess, and is seen as birthing, the world, then you respect women, you don't kill them. So that seems to have been the case in the very earliest times, and lots of evidence. Ryan Eisler's book, The Chalice and the Blade, talks about that, chalice culture in prehistory. The trouble is, as weapons become more sophisticated and as metals are invented, and you get into the Bronze Age, and you get into urbanization, you begin to get armies of male warriors. Now, and then we have a history of more or less continuous warfare on the planet since then. Initially they couldn't do too much damage because they're doing Trojan wars with swords and things. But now we're doing it with tridents and nuclear submarines. But it's the same principle. Now, throughout ancient history, we know there were many voices opposing violence. Pythagoras, one of the great philosophers, who was also deeply spiritual. And Plato, again, we call these people proto-spiritualists, really. They believed in an invisible world, and it's the job of the philosopher to rationally channel messages from that world. Socrates was accompanied by what he called his daimon, his guardian spirit. And these people spoke for a rational organisation of society. Plato began the study of ethics and political science. And that vision of it's possible to have a rationally based, spiritually intelligent society, which would be at peace, that lingers in our civilization. To do justice to the talk, therefore, I'd have to spend a long time looking at ancient history and then medieval history. But I'm going to skate over it and just say that vision of a world at peace, the Golden Age, was there in ancient Greek thought. It was there in ancient Hindu thought. They talk about Sat Yuga, the age of truth. There was a time people lived virtuously and righteously. And that's always been the goal of the sage, to get back there. And it always brings with it transparency to spirit. In medieval history, although it was a bloodthirsty time and there was a lot of insecurity and violence, the saints of the church, the monasteries, provided a haven. And the same in Islam, in the orders of Islam, in the spiritual orders of Sufism, there was a sense that the true jihad is the spiritual struggle. It's not going out and conquering the enemy. It's conquering the negativity within oneself, battling the demons of depression, despair, and the tendency towards negativity and psychic entropy that exists. So, the great saints of the medieval tradition sought peace through learning as well, and the rise of the universities was important. At that time, great philosophers were active, thinking how we can get a rational and peace-loving world. I want to look in a bit more detail in the early modern period, in the 18th century, because this is known as the time of the Enlightenment, time of reason, and it was the time of the opening up of the world. But there was also a spiritual story that's often written out of that period. The Enlightenment is known as the Age of Reason, and people tell that story as if it's about the rise of secularism and the rejection of all religion, and hence spiritualism and spirituality. There is another story, and from a transpersonal perspective, it's a very interesting story. It's sometimes called the Dark Enlightenment. And this is to do with the rise of things like mesmerism and Swedenborg, and the importance of Freemasonry in 18th century Europe. The Lodge of the Nine Sisters, based in Paris, was run by a chap called Antoine Coeur de Gebelin, who was the son of a pastor from Switzerland, and it involved a lot of the figures of the Enlightenment, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, Jeremy Bentham in London. And they were trying to look scientifically at what we would now call occult phenomenon. Antoine Coeur de Gebelin wrote an extraordinary book in French. It's 8 volumes, very rare thing, comparing the ancient and the modern world. And he was the first to argue that the tarot should be a mystical tool for divination, and that the tarot trumps equated to the Hebrew alphabet and the Kabbalah and so on. He was a esotericist. Mesmer was one of his closest friends, and in fact, Mesmer died. No, I think Antoine died. Well, they died in each other's arms. I can't remember the whole story, these two, in an experiment that didn't quite work out. Another chap who's interesting in that is Nicholas Bonneville, who was a friend of Thomas Paine and William Blake, and ran a society in Paris for the study of truth. It was called the Society for the Circle for the Study of Truth. And he was living through the bouleversement of the French Revolution, and he spoke for peace. He said, let the working classes and the aristocrats live in peace and harmony. Let's build a new society based on esoteric wisdom. Yes, get rid of the reactionary, stupidities of the medieval theocracy that have oppressed people's minds, the Inquisition and so on. But don't flip the other side and become fanatics rallying around Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. So Bonneville kept his head down and just advocated a peaceful revolution, a transformation of social consciousness. Rousseau, as well, was interested in such things, and with his rediscovery of the noble savage and the pagan, there was an understanding that maybe peace with primal peoples is important. And this is a theme, I think, that's become more important in the 20th century, and the role of anthropologists in studying the spirituality of primitive tribes, which are similar to our ancestors. Every culture began at a so-called primitive level. Indigenous peoples and aboriginals around the world are profoundly spiritual, and many phenomena that are studied by spiritualists are endemic in the shamanic tribes of Siberia and American Indians and so on. In the Celtic world, among the Irish and Welsh and so on, the Druids were involved with the same kind of phenomena, as we know from the literature. So man has this history of transpersonal voyaging. The 18th century saw mysterious figures like the Comte de Saint-Germain as well, a mysterious figure who seems to have historically existed, and again worked for peace through diplomacy at the courts of Europe. And sadly, politics bifurcated at the time of the French Revolution into right and left, extreme right versus extreme left. And that's still given a kind of colouring to political thinking right to this day, and we've seen that in the reigns of terror in Russia and China and so on. What was spiritualism doing at that time? Well, with people like Swedenborg and early adventurers in spirit, they were really raising their voices against the idiocy of wars. And I think it's tied in with the birth of Romanticism. Shelley and Blake and the great Romantics were the peace activists of their day. Shelley was interested in spiritual phenomena. Much of his poetry was what we would call channeled. And they saw the role of the bard or the poet as being to speak out against the idiocy of war. So that romantic streak, which was also exemplified by Blake, was an important early witness to peace from a transpersonal perspective. In the 19th century, with the Napoleonic Wars still raging, we see that in Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. Tolstoy was a great seeker of spiritual truth. He was a Freemason Christian mystic, studied all world philosophies, and he came to the conclusion that, we have to stick by the law of love, as he called it, the law of love and the law of peace. And in the end of the war, 1815, when the Napoleonic War was finally put to bed, there was a Russian mystic who persuaded the Tsar to found a kind of holy alliance. She was receiving channeling, we would say, from a spiritual dimension, and she wanted to see the monarchs of Europe make a kind of peace treaty that would last forever. And the Tsar actually listened to her. He tried to organise it. And it would have been quite a visionary project. I myself, in my own work, in peace work, have called for a council of monarchs on the planet. There's still 33 of them. I think if they made a lasting treaty and had a council like a little United Nations, I think it'd be a jolly good thing. And I've written off, suggesting it to them all, and occasionally get replies. But that was also her idea, way back at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Society also, other visionary thinkers came into play, like Saint-Simon, the French visionary, who died in 1825. He thought we could reform society. He wrote a book called The New Christianity. He said Christianity is great, but it's only symbolic. You go to church, you have your communion, it's a symbol. What we need to do is apply that in society. And he believed in rational spirituality. He said the law of Christ, love each other, should be then implemented socially. And his system was called socialism in French. But it was strongly spiritually based. And then Robert Owen in Britain, 1771 to 1858, independently came to the same idea. He was from Newtown in Welshpool in Wales, where I lived for 10 years. And he was very interested in social reform. And he became very interested in spiritualism. And he saw evidence, as spiritualism came to Britain, that proved to him the survival of the soul after death. And he felt that this had implications for how we organise society. Society should be organised on a more just and fair and sensible way. And that peace would be the natural consequence of our spiritual awareness being elevated. And he was really, I think, instrumental in moving spiritualism into a place of acceptability in British society. Meanwhile, in America, the birth of modern spiritualism took place at the Hydesville property, which is what we're celebrating in this lecture today, when the Fox sisters in 1848 experienced some strange phenomena, some raps, which most of you in the audience probably know about. Some maybe not. There were two sisters, and they experienced this strange rapping noises in the house, which they found they could communicate with. And it turned out to be an exchange between another world and this world. And it turned out to be the spirit of someone who'd been murdered in that house some time before. And eventually, indeed, a body was found of a travelling peddler. But the phenomenon was replicated. The Fox sisters then spread this idea that you could empirically contact, departed spirits. And in a sense, that was the birth of spiritualism as an organised movement. And by 1853, the first spiritualist church was set up in Britain in Keighley by people who'd met the Fox sisters and witnessed the phenomena. And Robert Owen got involved. He died 5 years later, having met these people and said, this is important, we should listen to what these people are doing. Later on that same century, after spiritualism had taken off both in Britain and America, Abraham Lincoln got involved with it. Not many people know. My talk is about war and peace and spiritualism. Lincoln based a lot of his policy decisions during the American Civil War on his belief in spiritualism. His wife was deeply involved in it. And I've not seen the new movie by Steven Spielberg. I don't know if he's gone into that side of it.
No.
Okay. But in fact, there's a quote by Lincoln when somebody said later in his life, were you influenced by spiritualism? How important was it for you? He said it was so important you've no idea. But the thing is that one's spiritual beliefs are often kept out of the public arena. So Lincoln's career as a spiritualist is not really talked about, but they actually did organise seances in the White House. And before his proclamation liberating the slaves, it came from spirit that this should be done. And a lot of the modern world was shaped, therefore, from that spiritual perspective. Now, soon after that, that emancipatory drive which Lincoln led for the ending of social injustice and slavery and so on, was then carried on by other people. A man called Colonel Olcott, who'd fought in the American Civil War on Lincoln's side, was friends with an amazing Russian woman called Helena Blavatsky, who you've probably all heard of. And Blavatsky was an extraordinary Russian. She was a Dolgoruki, which is a particular lineage of Russians going back to the Middle Ages, who've always been learned people and interested in mysticism and esotericism and so on. And she travelled in Egypt and all over the place before ending up in New York in 1875. And she helped organise a lecture by a man called Dr. George Felt on the Egyptian Kabbalah. And in the room were many learned people, including a woman called Emma Harding Britton and her husband, Dr. Britton. And the talk was so interesting, and they all stayed and they couldn't leave. They thought this was so interesting, because they were studying the Kabbalah and whether it existed in ancient Egypt before the Hebrew Kabbalah and so on, that they decided to found a society to keep research going in this and to look objectively and scientifically at the occult and mystical side of human history. And they decided to call it the Theosophical Society, because theosophy is the name for divine wisdom, right? And that was the birth of the Theosophical Society. Now, what's interesting is that Emma Harding Britton, who was influential in founding the TS, also was very important in the birth of spiritualism. And she threw herself into promoting and canvassing the birth of spiritualism in America. She wrote several books about it and was one of the most learned spokespeople for its integrity as a tradition. She also came to Britain, and now a number of historians have written about her life. She fell out on personality issues with Blavatsky, who was quite a bumpy character, but they were doing the same work. They just had to do it in different spheres. A bit later, the Society for Psychical Research was founded in the latter part of the 19th century, which was founded by a group of people including Frank Podmore, who again wanted to study spiritual and psychic phenomena scientifically. And one interesting character involved with all that was Thomas Davidson, who was a philosopher influenced by Italian Catholic advanced thinking about ethics and so on. And from that, the Fabian Society was born, which is something, again, not many people realise, the birth of the Fabian movement in Britain, a kind of socialist, utopian, let's make society better. Many peace campaigners have been Fabians over the years, such as Virginia Woolf's husband, Leonard Woolf, and people, came out of this spiritualist side of thought. Now, at the same time, in Austria and Switzerland and Germany, Carl Jung's ideas were gathering momentum, and Jung was already interested in the study of spiritual phenomena as a doctor involved with nursing mental health issues. He'd got involved, and obviously he thought Freud's ideas were very helpful to begin with, but he felt that Freud had ended up in a kind of a limiting series of explanations that all mental health phenomena could be put down to, frustrated libido. Jung didn't agree with that. He said, no, there's a whole spiritual side to man's nature, which is not about that side of things, and it should be studied scientifically. So he had to break away from Freud to carve out this other sphere of psychological thought, transpersonal psychology. And his ideas are very important for really the underpinning of transpersonal history. Now, Jung was also someone who believed in peace. He was in Scotland when World War I broke out, he'd had premonitory dreams about World War I starting. And he just, like all seers and psychics, they kind of pick up stuff before it happens. He'd already had these nightmares of Europe descending into a maelstrom. He managed to get back to Switzerland, literally almost down the trench lines from Scotland. And he then, through developing analytical psychology, he tried to find a way of understanding and unlocking the keys of the soul. What's the link between our individual imagination and our own individual life and our collective or group life? Is there such a thing as a collective unconscious? He coined that. There must be. Telepathy and the transmission of dreams, the transmission of thoughts at a distance and so on, which has been demonstrated, in the lab, in lead-sealed things by parapsychologists. I mean, Jung's theory of the collective unconscious is the only beginning of an attempt to explain how that works. Something else I want to say in the 19th century about the role of spiritualism, and to some extent in Jung's work, is there was a great overlap with the women's movement and the rise of feminist awareness and female emancipation. Many of the pioneers of spiritualism and theosophy were women. I mean, I've mentioned the Fox sisters and Emma Britton, but also Annie Besant and Blavatsky. And there's a whole list of other names. It's a very interesting field of research. Women traditionally have often been more subtle, more psychic than men. Why is that? Somebody should do some PhDs on this and report back. But it seems to be a factor that transpersonal awareness in history has often been in the female line. And shamans to this day in Korea and Japan are often women. Why is that? So in a sense, what this rebirth of spiritualism is about the rebirth of women's empowerment. Okay. And of course their voice was about peace. So in the run-up to World War I, there were many attempts by women's movements and spiritualist groups to prevent World War I. A woman called Fanny Andrews, an American, came to Europe and was organising an international peace conference of women due to meet in September 1914. Of course, it got cancelled because World War I broke out. It's a tragedy. It's also interesting that Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace were engaged in a lot of thinking at the end of the 19th century about human evolution and the nature of the soul, where we come from. And Darwin and Wallace simultaneously co-discovered the theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection. Now, not many people realise that Alfred Russel Wallace was also a spiritualist, and that he fell out with Darwin in a friendly and polite kind of way, because Darwin totally excluded from his worldview any kind of spirituality. His explanation for us sitting here in this room is because our cells, our biological nature has evolved over billions of years, and through our genetic evolution, that explains everything. Wallace said, but my dear friend Charles, I've sat in seances and I've seen phenomena that you cannot explain in that way. I've actually seen it with my eyes. Therefore, as a scientist, Wallace said, any general theory of explanation for reality and evolution has to include a spiritual dimension, right? Now, Wallace, very interestingly, I organised a couple of lectures in honour of A.R. Wallace, who's been forgotten by historians of science largely, and Darwin's got all the credit. I personally think Wallace was a much deeper thinker because of his actual honesty, his intellectual honesty at embracing the spiritual side of reality. And Wallace once organised for Darwin to come to a séance, and Darwin agreed. It was in Harley Street, and it was with one of the best mediums of the day. He finally persuaded him to come, and everything was set up. Just as the medium was about to start, they were just dimming the lights. Darwin got up and complained of a headache, and he had to go upstairs and lie down. Right? And then for 3 hours, with him sleeping upstairs, the room was subject to all kinds of phenomena. a table moved 20 feet through the air. All the chairs in the room ended up piled at one end. Nobody was touching a thing, of course. It was all just, spirit doing it. And all kinds of phenomena. And then after about 2 hours, Darwin came down. It had died down by then, and said, "Did I miss anything?" I always think that if Darwin had sat through that seance, the intellectual history of theories of evolution might have taken a different course. The other thing I want to say about Wallace, who lived from 1823 to 1913, is that he was a great peace activist. He ended up living in Bournemouth. He retired to Poole. And he was campaigning for peace in many different ways and was a social reformer and visionary. But he died in 1913, again, unable to prevent World War I happening. He believed that society could evolve, that individual evolution and social evolution work hand in hand with spirit. It's not that we evolve through natural selection at the material, physical level, but there's a spiritual evolution that goes on. You could call it almost supernatural selection. If there's natural selection, there's also supernatural selection. So the good ultimately tend to come together with the good and do good things. That's how society evolves. And peace would be part of that victory of goodness, if you want, long term. But, his work was way ahead of its time. Sadly, the world went with Darwin. And Darwin's rejection of spirituality then influenced generations of future scientists about what science actually is. And it gave birth to the machine age. There's a very sad story about how the Kaiser failed to prevent World War I breaking out, which I think sums up in a book on the moral history of the 20th century by a philosopher at University College. He tells the story in great detail. The Kaiser, although he was bellicose and wanted Germany to be great, he didn't really want to see the whole of Europe go up in flames. And he signed the order for a general mobilisation, according to the Schlieffen Plan, which involved an invasion of Belgium, which had done nothing to knock out France, But a few hours after signing it, that night, he had a bad conscience. And he called his generals back in the room. He said, "I want to cancel the invasion. I'm unsigning the order. Call the troops back." And what they explained to him is that war was now a mechanized, industrial thing. The mass trains carrying the troops had already crossed into Belgium. The bombs had already started falling. And the orders had gone out by telegraphy. A mass mobilisation involving, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And it was technically not possible to call it back. In other words, the industrialisation of violence had gone so far, the Kaiser himself was a victim of it. And that, to me, is one of the most tragic sort of signs of how spirit becomes oppressed by machinery and technology. So, I want to say that it's interesting that Karl Marx dedicated his work, Das Kapital, to Darwin. Because just as Darwin's rejection of spirituality led to all kinds of problems, I think Marx's rejection of spirituality also led to the taking out of spirit and the taking out of ethical conscience of the individual from history. You see, the Marxist vision of history is a bit like the troop trains leaving for the front. History's inevitable. Progress will come, according to certain scientific laws, as Marx said. But unfortunately, this leads to the Stalinist kind of approach to reality, which is peace will be caused by the victory of the Communist Party and the suppression of everyone that dissents. They're about to put up a statue to George Orwell, who witnessed the horrors of totalitarian society. And the Gulag, the horrors of the Gulag that Solzhenitsyn wrote about, I think come about ultimately from that rejection of spirituality. Freud's similar rejection of spirituality and dismissal of parapsychology, was a similar thing. It's an attempt to find a purely materialistic explanation for history. But at least his ideas had led to, a profound look at psychohistory. And I would also just say that Marx's legacy is actually more complex than first sight. In my own research at the University of London, I discovered Marx was involved in a whole network of esoterics in the 19th century who were actually working for a spiritual transformation of society. He was in touch with various occult groups, Freemasonic groups, and so on, and probably had studied certain forms of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, and so on. And so, deep down in the soul of Marxism, there may be something that is working for transformation, but it's hidden. And also, historians have looked at the role of the Soviet Union. They were exploring parapsychology in great detail, and in Russia they still are. So there is a possibility of extracting a peace vision from that lineage too. In the 20th century, after World War I, after the chaos, the Bolsheviks and their revolution was one attempt to solve history, but I think, as I've said, a flawed attempt because of its suppression of spiritual wisdom. A lot of the greatest Russian philosophers and thinkers had to leave Russia. Lenin put them on a train in 1921 and said, "Get out." People like Berdyaev and these great Christian mystics. And Sorokin, who went to Harvard to study the psychology of altruism, very great thinker. These people couldn't operate inside Leninist and Stalinist Russia. In France, the most famous philosopher at that time was Henry Bergson, who worked with the League of Nations in forming a thing called the International International League for Intellectual Cooperation. And the vision was that the thinkers of the day could all come together and make peace. And it was the forerunner of UNESCO. Right. And Bergson was president. He got Albert Einstein involved. He got Gilbert Murray involved from Britain and many others. And they hoped that through getting sort of discussion among the philosophers and intellectuals and scientists, they could head off any future violence. It was a peace initiative. Bergson himself was Jewish and very interested in parapsychology. And he became president of the Society for Psychical Research in London. And his philosophy was an attempt. He also included Einstein's work, his vision of relativity theory, in his own attempts to make sense of life. He came up with the idea of the élan vital, this life force that's inside us. And he looked at how time and memory work. He reckoned the brain acts like a kind of radio set. And that when the signals, the cosmic rays, the signals of ideas which are out there, we can tune into what we want, and we can either open up to many bands or a few. But it's not generating the thought. Thought somehow exists beyond the body. The brain is just the receiver for it. Bergson's ideas are way ahead of time. But unfortunately he died in World War II when the Nazis invaded France. As a Jew he was forced to wear the yellow star and everything. Which brings me to historians. I did part of my history degree at the London School of Economics International History Department, and we had all the kind of professors who've written the official histories of World War II. I also nursed World War II veterans in Canada as a nurse back in the 70s and 80s. And I know, that was a tough war. What's not often written about is the spiritual side of it. It's an undeniable fact that the Nazi movement had what I call a false spiritualism, which was quite important. People like Hess and others had a kind of drivenness in their worldview. And their kind of false spiritualism was tied in with racism, with the suppression of anyone that wasn't of their superior master Aryan German race. And there's a very important book just written by a philosopher called Hitler's Ethic, which is the first attempt to look at all his writings and speeches and say what was driving this guy. And the conclusion is that it was Darwinianism. Hitler was a devotee of Darwin, and he took literally the idea of the struggle of the survival of the fittest. he said, yes, well, our race will win. We will destroy the others. And, you know, it's an important new book that's come out, looking at Hitler as a quote-unquote philosopher. And it also reveals that Hitler used religion simply as a gloss, as a tool. He said in many private asides, because he was brought up a Catholic, that he did not believe the teachings of Christianity, but he was prepared to pretend to, just to get the votes. Secretly, he regarded what he was doing as you know, he thought Christianity was just stupid. It was a religion of the weak. And he wanted a religion of the strong, based on this Darwinian model. Now, that is a tragedy. And it meant that he had no time for ethics and conscience. You know, so the destruction of the Jewish people he saw as a social duty. No idea of conscience. Now, this whole idea of anti-Semitism, which Hitler espoused, to me is based on a total misunderstanding of the ancient links going back into prehistory between Indo-European and Semitic peoples, which I think are interconnected linguistically and historically. And I've just written a book called The Kabbalah Runes about this, looking at the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, and the Scandinavian runes, the Anglo-Saxon runic alphabet. And in that work, I think I've been able to demonstrate how the two esoteric systems are interlinked. You know, the true rune masters of the Anglo-Saxon Germanic peoples were the equivalent of the sages of the Hebrews. They were like the spiritualists of their day. When the first Saxon settlers came and lived in Sussex off their ships, they'd always have a sage with his runes. Now, the runic alphabet is a kind of map of reality, and it taught about how to link between this mundane plane and the spiritual plane, exactly in the way that the Kabbalah does with the Tree of Life. So I've been able to demonstrate the links. Now, the true rune masters of Germany opposed Hitler because they knew that he'd pinched a bit of their thunder and, you know, used a few runes on SS symbols and stuff, but had actually totally misunderstood the ethics. And the really intelligent, wise rune masters were all stuck in concentration camps by Hitler. So, meanwhile, in Britain, you know, a lot of the spiritualists had a difficult choice to make in World War II. Should they fight or shouldn't they? Some were pacifists, some fought. And we're fortunate, actually, that some fought, because Air Chief Marshal Dowding, I think, people don't realise, probably saved this country from a Nazi invasion. He was the head of the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. And it was him who first realised the importance of radar, and he organised the rather limited resources of the Royal Air Force, its Spitfires and so on, in an intelligent enough way that when the mass fleets of German bombers came over, they could organise a defence. And literally, the Battle of Britain was his baby, which he won. And that was a time, don't forget, before America came into the war. Britain was literally fighting alone. And had we lost the Battle of Britain, we would have been invaded by the Nazis, and I wouldn't be able to make this lecture, for one thing. Now, what people don't know is that Air Chief Marshal Dowding was a spiritualist. Very, very profound and intensely devoted spiritualist. And after the war, he wrote a number of books about his belief in spiritualism. And he basically said we were saved by the angels. You know, there were so few fighter pilots that he had in his command. And he had numerous reports of what you can only call supernatural intervention up there in the skies. That he did, you know, profoundly believe that Britain was protected from spirit. And, you know, you should read his works. They're fascinating. After World War II sets in the Cold War, and this is something I studied for my doctoral thesis in great detail, Russia and America, hammer and tongs, KGB versus CIA. Now, what's not known is that this was very involved with the search for mind powers. And, you know, people were looking into telepathy as military use. They call it remote viewing. The American intelligence had a program for remote viewing. very handy. I mean, if there's remote viewers in Washington that can look at what North Korea is doing now, it's very useful. Both sides were trying to practice and develop this. I once had a chat with Uri Geller, who's quite famous for his psychic powers. He told me that he was once, I don't think I'm breaking confidence, and you may have written about this. He said he was once taken by the CIA for some tests to see whether he would be able to stop the heart of a pig in the next door room using his mind powers. And he walked out. He refused to do it. He said, even if I could, I'm not prepared to use my psychic powers for violence in that way. But I'm sure other people, were trained. And so in the history of the Cold War, it's very interesting. Chinese intelligence also was doing the same thing with brainwashing programs and so on. And with the invasion of Tibet and the attempted eradication of Tibetan Buddhist culture, there is a kind of psychic side to the Cold War which has not really been researched, which I've attempted in my own little way to do. Also in the history of the Korean War, similarly, there's an untold story. My own hope is that people wouldn't misuse their psychic and spiritual powers for violence. And, the story Uri Geller told me, I think, is one of hope. I think spiritual wisdom has its own sort of self-limiting ethics, so that as you advance in spiritual awareness, your ethics normally increases and you don't misuse those powers. It's also interesting that as the atomic bomb was invented and dropped at the end of World War II, and the anti-atomic bomb movement began, a lot of people who were very spiritually aware got involved in that movement. And the anti-nuclear war bomb culture, if you want, I think was to some extent spiritually driven. People like E.P. Thompson in Britain, Bruce Kent, the Berrigan brothers in America, many of these campaigners, many of them Quakers or Christians of some kind, have been influenced by their vision of an alternative world in which we don't need nuclear weapons to make peace with each other. Martin Luther King is an important figure at this time in the peace movement generally, in the late 20th century. And the Gandhian movement influenced that time. The Gandhi Foundation, which I worked with for 3 years, still has summer schools and lectures and so on. And in India, when I go to India and teach there, that tradition is still very much alive. I've been asked by the Indian government to nominate somebody for the Gandhi Peace Prize this year. They give it away. It's like a Nobel Prize every year. It's still a living tradition. The historians have also looked at the hippie movement in the 60s, the flower power movement, as a consciousness explosion. That was tied in with the peace movement and the rejection of the Vietnam War. Now, the story of transpersonal thought, the development of transpersonal psychology, is tied in with the birth of that hippie movement in the 60s. People like Timothy Leary and others are famous names, Richard Alpert. But they were not only rejecting war, they were also demanding the right to explore consciousness and saying the important journey we should all be taking is an inner journey, not an outer conquest of Vietnam or whatever, Soviet Union, but an inner journey to conquer our own despair and ignorance and depression and so on. And centres like Esalen in Big Sur in California became centres for research into altered states of consciousness and transpersonal psychology. Abraham Maslow and people, they developed a thing called the International Transpersonal Psychology Association, which is still going. The Pacifica Graduate Institute in California is also one of the centres of this. People like Joseph Campbell contributed. And I think that was a positive sign for mankind, that discovery of the transpersonal dimension and the search for altered states of being. The Beatles were part of that culture and their turn to Eastern spirituality. And it's part of our history, if you want. Now, in the late 70s, 79, with the invasion of Afghanistan, there was a new edge given. After the sort of peace treaty in Vietnam, and there was a dying down of problems and a period of détente. But in 79, the invasion of Afghanistan brought a new series of troubles. Afghanistan had always been the haven of the hippie trail on the way to India. And apparently, friends of mine who'd been there at that time said it was a beautiful, amazing culture in Kabul. Idris Shah, a great Sufi, had come from Afghanistan, lived in Brighton for a while, teaching kind of, the reconciliation of Eastern and Western thought. But suddenly there was a war going on in Afghanistan. And it was really ultimately a war of spirits. When I went to Moscow in 1990, just after it had finished, as Gorbachev had pulled out the Soviet troops, it was a disaster for Russia that war took place. I think this is why I'm against war. It's just very stupid. And it's no way to behave to one's neighbours. And of course it then brought up a counter-reaction. In the study of transpersonal history, you often find movements and then counter-movements, and then counter-movements to those. A bit like Toynbee said in his study of history. There's action and reaction. And of course if you attack somebody, they'll attack you back. So the unleashing of Islamic fundamentalism and the Taliban was an unintended consequence of that Soviet invasion. We're still trying to clean up the pieces after that. So although the Cold War ended in Europe in 1990, and I went to conferences in Prague, and I founded my Peace Institute at the University of London in around about 1990, and we all thought we were going to enter an era of peace. In fact, and I was elected coordinator of Philosophers of Peace at that time in a conference in Moscow, globally, and we all thought it was going to be, the peace dividend we talked about and so on. In fact, it was the unleashing of chaos and conflict in the Middle East and also in the Balkans, with the breaking up of Yugoslavia, and these religious wars that were happening, each of which had this spiritual dimension to it. And, I was flying last night down from Scotland next to someone from Zagreb in Croatia, talking about the pain, the scars are still there in the Balkans, between the Serbs and other parts of former Yugoslavia. So, where do we go next? In the Middle East, the wars that Israel has fought, and Israel and Palestine, again, unfinished business during the whole of this same period of the 20th century I've been talking about, Six-Day Wars and others, and it leaves psychic scars on the people, Palestinians and Israelis. I've talked to psychiatrists and psychologists who study the mental health issues affecting both communities are horrendous. I'm speaking simply as a doctor of philosophy who believes that my first job is to help the healing process. So we have to look, I think, at the spiritual causes and solutions to the problems of fear, alienation, and hatred. So there's a crisis of what I call interfaith misunderstanding in the Middle East. In the late 20th century, in the 90s, I was Secretary General of the World Conference on Religion and Peace in Britain and Ireland. It took me to conferences throughout Britain and Europe, to the Vatican and places, and I met philosophers and religious leaders, and I went to Israel and Palestine first in 1996. And my study as a philosopher is that the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and Sufism, Islamic mysticism, go back to the same root, as does Christian mysticism. And the sooner we get these people to recognise they're all brothers and sisters singing from the same hymn sheet, the better we can get peace in that region. So I set up a thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, which is a spirit-led project, but working with the intellectuals and with the thinkers and sages and savants of that era. My recent book on the Kabbalah runes is an attempt again in that direction. And in the late 90s I set up this multi-faith mediation service, trying to offer, in effect, preventative counselling to people that are, on the verge of destroying each other. Now, so things were quite optimistic, I think. There were problems, but 2001, the attacks on 9/11 unleashed a whole other upping of the ante, shall we say. And Bush and Blair launched their war on terror, which to me is, as a philosopher, is an illogical kind of concept. It's like having a war on shadows, or a war on terror just generates more terror, more fear. What there should have been was an immediate commission of inquiry into who was actually behind 9/11, in depth, in detail. I even wrote to my colleagues in America and suggested a royal commission. And then, of course, that led to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq in 2003, and an ongoing cycle of violence, which even this country is still implicated in. People are still dying in Afghanistan. So, as a philosopher of peace, from a spiritualist perspective, I'd say this whole scenario is like a bad chapter in a novel that I'm getting bored with. And I want to move on to the novel where we get the spiritual leaders of Afghanistan and Iraq and Britain and America in dialogue, sharing with each other their innermost visions of what is peace, how can we build peace, and that peace has to be transpersonal and vertical as well as horizontal. It's not just about this power block and economic system making a peace treaty with that block. That's horizontal peace building. Vertical is when we make an alignment between our own higher self and each other's higher selves, and our own prophets and your prophets, and our own prophetic consciousness and our own higher nature. So it's a search for peace between religions. Now, fortunately, there are groups working on this. The United Religions Movement, the World Parliament of Religions, interfaith peace building is going on, and I'm playing my own role in that. But it's not happening fast enough, and it's not happening at a level of intense enough discussion or influence. And we see the need for it in Iraq. There's still bombings happening in Afghanistan. Libya, one would have thought things could have been resolved in a more intelligent way. It's going on in Syria as we speak, with ethnic and religious violence going on. And I've been trying to get the European Union to help mediate that. And I've just written a book about the need for a peace policy in Syria. It's still going on in Israel and Palestine, and unsolved conflicts. And in China and Tibet, where Tibetan monks are still burning themselves on a regular basis, and the world seems to do nothing. It's still going on in Kashmir and the India-Pakistan problems there. And finally, it's now going on again in Korea. It's endless. Now, I think there are solutions to all these problems, and I think that if you apply spiritual intelligence to these problems, you can actually get solutions. I don't believe anybody in their right minds wants a nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula, but nobody quite knows where the fire hydrant is. Well, I think what I'm delivering in this talk today is where it might be found. Okay. Philosophy is about healing and the spiritual work. I know there's a healing group here, for instance. True spirituality is always about healing, it seems to me. Now, the solutions to violent conflict are precisely the mediation techniques that have been developed by spiritually advanced thinkers over this same time period and before. Techniques in conflict resolution and mediation have been developed by Quakers and others, by Anglicans and Christian groups throughout the world. The Mennonites are particularly good at that. The church dedicated to non-violence. And there are academic programs throughout the States and Britain and Europe where they train peacemakers in non-violent communication skills and mediation. Conflict resolution techniques work, and what we need is to get people with those trainings to actually go and, in a sense, take over from the diplomats, because diplomats and politicians create the problems. They have vested interests of their political hierarchies, and they're not going to solve them. 2 women that just won the Nobel Peace Prize, who sorted out a problem in an African country, Sierra Leone possibly, they did it by locking the men, literally, into the building and getting all their womenfolk from the villages to come and surround the building and refuse to let them out until they worked out a deal, which is brilliant, right? And that's how they won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. If you read in their acceptance speech, she describes what they did. That's how they did it. That's what the women of the world have to do, and particularly the spiritually aware ones among them, which are most of them, and the men that have got that spiritual intelligence have to support that work, it seems to me. That is happening, but it needs picking up a pace. The UN itself, the United Nations, was inspired precisely by that vision, that spiritual vision of unity. If you look at the history of the founding of the UN, Roosevelt and Churchill and so on, they knew deep down they were doing a spiritual work for peace. They were going to prevent World War III happening. But I've spoken twice at the UN headquarters, and I've been to there in New York. And there's a small meditation room at the UN in New York. It's worth going to if you're ever there. Just got a stained glass window by Chagall. It's no bigger than this room. In fact, it's even a bit smaller. I'm not kidding. Yeah, I was disappointed. I thought it would be huge. It's smaller than this room, right? And there's only a few chairs, and you can go in and sit and meditate whenever you want. And I thought, blimey, it's not very big. How are they going to do this? But in fact, there is a group that meets there and does meditation. And there's people involved with the World Goodwill Movement. Alice Bailey is another of these female theosophist leaders who had a vision of peace through spiritual, intelligence. And they are still working, connected with the UN and organising meditations for peace in the UN meditation room. Dag Hammarskjöld, who was one of the UN Secretary Generals, was a very spiritually aware person from Scandinavia who wrote a book called Markings. And so, that the UN is trying to hold things together, but it's touch and go. So we're asked to tune in and join in meditations, and focus light on the work of the UN. It's the least we can do, it seems to me. Now I'm going to come to my conclusion, the last part of my talk. Well, the conclusion is about work that needs to be done. That's the state. I've given you a whistle-stop tour of history from a transpersonal perspective and war and peace. Well, it leaves us with a lot of work to do, not just individually those of us in this room, but the planet as a whole. Firstly, we need disciplined dialogue between the religions and the scientific community on the planet. One thing that upsets me is arrogance on either side. You meet a certain kind of religious leader that wants nothing to do with science. They say scientists are just boring mathematicians, just deal with the mundane. I'm a man of God or a woman of the goddess. And you also meet arrogant scientists that say, I'm not going to talk to you because you're spouting God stuff, I don't do God, and it's all just nonsense. We have to have a disciplined dialogue between these two groups. And in that, the spiritualists can play a vital role, because you guys are looking at spirit in an intelligent and scientific way. You're looking empirically, but let's say spiritually empirically. Yeah, so you're at a pioneer place. So things like the the various spiritualist groups and communities and study centres around the planet can really help this work. And I'd like to see you more involved. The Templeton Prize is given each year for someone that researches the links between science and spirituality. We need more of those kind of things. There should be a Brighton Templeton Award or something. Every city should have one. And you have the University of Sussex, you have many scientists in this town. There should be a dialogue going on. People interested in transpersonal psychology and the scientific study of altered states of consciousness can contribute, I think, to that dialogue. People researching brain science. Obama, bless him, just announced, was it $20 billion to go into brain science? He's a clever man, Obama. And he's realised that actually consciousness matters. And figuring out how we think, and therefore how the brain goes wrong, is important. So American scientists are looking at, brain structure, but they have to look at it in a more subtle way. And I just hope those programs and all that money goes to thinkers looking at the subtle nature of consciousness as well. We also have to work, therefore, with scientists able and willing to abandon rigid determinism and a sort of a pre-packaged atheism. People like Dawkins, bless him, who have a kind of animosity against spirituality and are not prepared to do the research. In his book, The God Delusion, there are so many errors of fact. He just simply doesn't really know what he's talking about when it comes to religions. He's not done his homework. To counter that, since I teach religious studies as a secondary school teacher, amongst other things, I produced a periodic table of the world's religions and philosophies as a scientific tool for the people like Dawkins to actually understand how important the full complexity of the religions of the planet is. There's 168 different religious and philosophical traditions. On the website, you click on each box and it comes up with all the data on it. And that includes all the scientific traditions. They're part of, not opposed to, the spiritual history of mankind. So that's a really great tool which I produced for this work. We can also do things like I'm doing in the Castle of the Muses in Scotland, actually researching the nature of divine intelligence. In the debate between creationists and Darwinians, which, Dawkins versus Christian theists, it's reached a sort of an armed truce, really. I don't think they're talking very, very intelligently anymore. So what I've tried to do is set up a centre for the study of divine intelligence in Scotland. We have an annual meeting. And to try and actually look at what this divine intelligence might be like, if we take as a hypothesis that there is some spiritual energy behind the universe, the first principle of the spiritualist movement, that there is a kind of God or spiritual figure, well then what is it like? What does it do? And how does it actually impact on life, on living systems, on evolution, on our cells, on our minds, and so on? These are legitimate questions to ask from a scientific perspective. And it's taking place near Inverary, where the Duke of Argyll in the Victorian era was a great opponent of Darwin because he believed in divine intelligence, and he was a good friend of Queen Victoria. She used to go and visit Inverary Castle. So I feel I've got Victoria on our side here. she definitely believed in divine intelligence, and our duty as thinkers is to say, well, how does it work? And that's, the spiritualists can play a leading role in that. There's figures like Douglas Baker, who's a theosophist, who has written about the spiritual impact of war. He fought in World War II, saw many people dying, and he's written as a theosophist and esotericist about what happens in time of war on an occult or spiritual basis. Russian psychologists in the Battle of Leningrad observed many paranormal things happening among the troops in time of fighting and war when the adrenaline's running. They were getting all kinds of telepathy experiences, and which literally sometimes saved their lives. And warrior, I have a lot of respect for warriors. I've nursed them, I've met them. Some of my best friends have been generals. But I have the greatest respect for warriors that don't need to use their physical force and try and make peace simply through goodwill. The greatest samurai warrior made peace with his enemy. And so I think that needs to be researched. Because paradoxically, the armed forces, if they could be involved in peacemaking in an intelligent way, then they're perhaps our best workers. And it's interesting, I was talking recently to a chap from Northern Ireland who was in the security services for many years, doing all kinds of dangerous stuff. And he was very involved in the Belfast spiritualist community, which was flourishing at the time of the Troubles during the 30 years of bombings, IRA versus Protestants. Many people don't realise there's a very flourishing spiritualist church in Belfast that he told me all about and lent me some books from. And bless them, the spiritualists in Belfast were trying to sort of appeal somewhere between these raging battle zones that there's another way. And that voice needs to be researched and written up, and the witness of spiritualists to peace needs to be brought out more, I think. I founded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland because of my interest, I'm part Irish myself, in healing those conflicts. And because of my interest in the Druid community, Ireland has a very rich heritage of ancient wisdom that, should be about peace. The Druids of old were the peacemakers in the community. And the warriors used to listen to them. I think we should bring back those days. The Arthur Findlay College could also be doing some research in the spiritualist history of its contribution to peace, I think. There's also a need to compare and contrast esoteric systems. This is where philosophers of comparative religion come in. because we're very blessed to be alive at this time on the planet. More is known about the esoteric history of mankind than ever before in the planet's history. You used to have to go off and study with a master for decades to even get a tiny little fraction of what's now available. What we need is to work out a general theory, how these esoteric systems all fit together. And in my own research, I've produced this as a kind of guide map, the periodic table chart, but also this dictionary of universal saints and sages. In every lineage, every tradition, there are living and past masters and wisdom teachers. This should be the curriculum for mankind, studying these people. Not the ones that bring violence and suffering and pain. So in my comparison of the runes and the Kabbalah, for instance, that's just the beginning. Now, sometimes spiritualists have problems with Orthodox Christians. If you look at the history of spiritualism as a movement, I've just been to the Vatican Library in Rome and studying away, beavering away in the shelves there. And I think that research into the spiritual dimension of reality should be a core duty of every Christian scholar. After all, Christ spoke about the kingdom of heaven. Well, what is the kingdom of heaven if not, the higher dimensional realities that surround this plane of being? Surely, unless I've read the wrong Gospels, that's the whole essence of what Christ was saying. Because there's a kingdom of heaven, therefore, our lives should be transformed. Well, the research into the nature, the exact details and nature of the kingdom of heaven should therefore be a Christian scholar's first duty. And indeed, for the greatest of them, it always has been. And if you look at the great medieval scholastics, Duns Scotus from Scotland and Aquinas and people, the question they were always asking is, what is heaven? Where is it? What's it like? How do we get there? What's going on? So many of the churches have set up spiritual study groups. And, they should all be beavering away at what I'm talking about. But working with Hindus, with Tantric Buddhists, with Sufis and so on. I used to know a man called Dom Sylvester Huedard, great Benedictine mystic who lived at Grenache Abbey. And he used to have visiting Buddhist monks studying with him. He was a Roman Catholic mystic, but the Dalai Lama would send him advanced Buddhists to compare meditational techniques. That kind of work, is really important and should be encouraged. I think the other thing we can do then is work out an integral approach to the study of history. Why don't our history departments in our universities teach what I'm talking about, transpersonal history? Just endlessly go regurgitating how Bismarck unified Germany, or how, material plane history happens. Add in a bit of transpersonal history, and I think kids would love history again. It makes it much more interesting. And the greatest historians, von Ranke and Toynbee and all the others, have always included this dimension, because it's ultimately history is the history of our spirit as it unfolds. Ken Wilber's done tremendous work with his integral map of reality, but that needs to be extended and made available, to the conventional academic in their history department. The other part of what I'm talking about, therefore, is to work out a map of gender studies, gender history, and this brings in the feminist approach to religious studies. I mentioned several times in this talk that women have an important role in bringing that spiritual witness to bear and in the peace witness. One of my dear mentors, Professor Elise Boulding, pioneer of peace studies, who's now dead, wrote a book called The Underside of History, about women's history. And, this is the untold history that needs to be brought out. So we need to work on a trans-denominational liberation theology, if you want. And that involves seeing the good news inside every faith, finding where it has the keys hidden to the kingdom of God in its own language. Each religion is a pathway which teaches a way to the spiritual kingdoms in a solid, sensible and safe way. Right. But they often hide the keys, or they hide them behind experts who, hide them away. And Christ used to grumble about these kind of things. He'd say, look, those rabbis over there, they know where the kingdom of God is, but they've hidden the keys and they won't let you get in. Do you remember that saying? And he was saying, I'm trying to open the door to let people have this spiritual knowledge. That's surely the point of education at its best, at its highest point, is to open that kingdom to us all. And then the peace floods like a light. Now, part of that work has to be, therefore, working on the language of spirituality. I'm speaking in English, but, it's just one language. Many other languages. I could have given this lecture in different languages, and each has a different nuance. One of the projects I've been working on with my institute is a dictionary of philosophical and spiritual terminology across all different language systems. So Hebrew, Arabic, Sanskrit, ancient Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Pali, Tibetan, Chinese, Arabic, and so on. They all have slightly different nuances. What's the link between language and spirituality? That's a really interesting question. Why can't I live in a world where there's a couple of million quid available for that kind of research instead of the latest weapon, gadget and gizmo? Put me together with 100 scholars, each speaking different languages. We'll get peace in no time, So, to conclude, man is a transpersonal animal. We're a noetic animal. I hope my talk has demonstrated some of the ways in which that's manifested in history. Therefore, peace for us must involve that noetic dimension. Noetic is an adjective that comes from nous, which is Aristotle's term for active intellect, N-O-U-S. Noetic is the adjective. There's an Institute for Noetic Sciences in California, of course, they're all in California, which was founded by Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, who went to the moon and had a religious awakening. He saw the planet and he realised we have to live together as one, people. So he founded this Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is based on this concept from Aristotle, that the divine intellect that lives within each of us is our immortal soul. In Aristotle's teaching, that noetic faculty is what survives death. Okay. So what is it? Where does it come from? Where does it go? Does it reincarnate? How does it reincarnate? Where does it live between lives? These are all the questions that we have a right to know the answers to. And we need to have the intellectual courage to ask them and to demand of our scientists who get paid enormous salaries from state funding to research, the mechanics of cellular formation, to actually ask some of these bigger questions. So that's noetic science. Because, as I'm arguing in this talk, peace will come, therefore, for us when we have a greater understanding of that noetic dimension of our lives. And everyone can contribute to that. Spiritualists can, as I've said. The entire Christian community ought to be doing so, and many of them are. But also the pagans, the rune masters, the druids, they're bearers of ancient wisdom that's come down from of old. Everybody has like a snippet. It's time to put them together. The Kabbalists, the same. When I was in Israel, speaking to Kabbalists, they're incredible people. I said, look, if I brought you a bunch of Sufis who are prepared to sit down with you and talk, would you be happy to share your wisdom? They said yes. So we dreamed up the idea of opening the Golden Gate in the eastern wall of Jerusalem, which is symbolically shut. It won't be open until the Messiah comes, and only then will peace come. So me and my friends got together and we went to the Golden Gate in the eastern wall of Jerusalem. And we were Muslims, Sufis, Kabbalists, Christians. And we said, well, why can't we open it collectively? Why can't we have a big celebration, invite all the religious leaders of the planet, Archbishop of Canterbury, the new Pope, Hindu, Swamis and so on, and we'll open the gate symbolically and go in together, saying we mankind, as a whole collectively, want peace. So it's a symbol. So any Messiah said, please come and join, but we're not going to wait for you anymore. It's been too long. So that's one project. If you Google on the Golden Gate project, it comes up. And I think that I'm a great believer. I want you to go away with a profound sense of optimism from this talk. Okay. Spirit will organise peace somehow, as it has been doing. ever since mankind first, appeared. Quite how, who, when, will the Golden Gate be open this year, next year, 10 years, or some other project, some other gate somewhere. My just final conclusion is to keep that spark of optimism inside each one of us, to go on doing our work, our spiritual adventuring or journeying, as many of you said, and to just have faith that, collectively we will get there. And I think it's about joined up thinking. This is a slogan used in government circles, but it's also used in Kingdom of Heaven circles. We need joined up thinking. That's how we'll get there. And that involves different elements of the scientific and intellectual and spiritual community working together.